In the spring of 1864, Union soldiers forced open a set of rusted iron doors beneath a crumbling plantation house in Burke County, Georgia. What they found inside would haunt even the most battle-hardened men. Huddled together in the damp darkness of the basement were 23 children. Their faces were pale, their bodies thin, their wide eyes reflecting both fear and something else, an eerie resemblance to the woman who had once ruled over them. High cheekbones, sharp jawlines, and uncanny green eyes marked them as kin, though their chains revealed they were still enslaved. The eldest, a girl of 13, whispered words that left soldiers stunned. "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave, because we are her blood." That single sentence revealed a truth more horrifying than the soldiers could comprehend. These children were not merely victims of slavery. They were the products of a calculated system, born of cruelty and obsession, bred deliberately by a plantation mistress who believed she could secure her power through bloodlines. It was a chapter of American history, so disturbing that local records erased it, military archives buried it, and communities refused to speak of it for generations. Tonight, we unearth what others tried to forget. This is the story of Catherine Thornhill, the widow who turned her plantation into a breeding ground for her own children and enslaved men. A woman who believed she was building a dynasty, but who left behind only whispers, ruins, and shadows. If this opening already chills your spine, make sure you subscribe to Grave of the Shadows. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you're listening from. History hides its darkest truths in plain sight, and together we bring them back to light. The strange tragedy of Thornhill Estate should have been one of the most notorious scandals in Southern history. Yet if you search the official records of Burke County, you will find nothing. Local histories omit the estate entirely, as though the land never existed. Even in military documents, the story appears only once, buried in a confidential letter from the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, hidden in regimental archives for more than a century. It was not until fragments of testimony surfaced decades later that whispers of Catherine Thornhill's secrets began to take form. Why was this story buried so deeply? Because it exposed the most grotesque consequence of a system already built on exploitation. Slavery in Georgia was brutal enough. Families torn apart, bodies reduced to labor, children sold before they could even speak. But Catherine Thornhill carried the logic of bondage to its most horrifying extreme, breeding children with her own enslaved men, then raising those offspring as property bound by both law and blood. The tale unsettled even those who lived through it. Neighbors knew something strange occurred at Thornhill, but they kept their distance. The surviving children were scattered after emancipation, their lineage whispered about but never acknowledged. And so the story of the mistress who bred slaves with her own sons became an open secret, passed down not in books, but in hushed voices, kitchen corners, church basements, family stories guarded with caution. What you're about to hear is more than just hidden history. It is a reminder of how power corrupts when unchecked, and how entire communities sometimes conspire to bury the truth. Now, let's go back to where it all began. A February morning in 1847, when a young widow stood over her husband's grave and began imagining a plan that would scar generations. February 1847, Burke County, Georgia. The winter had been the coldest in 20 years. A biting wind swept across the red clay fields, rattling the bare branches of pecan trees and settling frost on the roofs of sagging slave cabins. Inside Thornhill Estate, a two-story brick house that once symbolized prosperity, silence reigned. Jonathan Thornhill, the master of the estate, was dead. He had been buried just days before, his coffin lowered into frozen earth while his young widow, Catherine Danforth Thornhill, stood dressed in black. She was only 28, but the lines around her mouth already suggested steel. Catherine had grown up in privilege. Her father, Theodore Danforth, was a wealthy Augusta merchant, and Catherine had been raised with tutors, French lessons, and the expectation that she would one day manage a grand household. Marrying Jonathan at 19 had been a strategic match, a union of merchant wealth and plantation land. What she inherited, however, was far from a thriving kingdom. Thornhill Estate had once stretched across 1,700 acres. In the 1820s, it flourished with cotton, But decades of overworked soil and Jonathan's reckless gambling had left it a shadow of its former self. Mortgaged to the hilt, its fields yielded little more than enough to feed the enslaved workers. Of the original 42 enslaved people, only 31 remained. 16 had been sold off in desperate attempts to appease creditors. The main house leaked, furniture had been pawned, and the overseer's whip cracked louder than ever to squeeze labor from exhausted bodies. Catherine surveyed this ruin with fury. Returning to her father's roof in Augusta meant humiliation. Living as a dependent widow, whispered about as the woman who squandered her inheritance. Selling the estate meant surrender. She saw neither as acceptable. There was one person who could have interfered. Her stepson, Richard Thornhill, 16 years old, Jonathan's child from his first marriage. Richard was pale, bookish, with a quiet sympathy toward the enslaved. He was no ally. He had once suggested teaching the workers to read, a dangerous notion Catherine had crushed instantly. She regarded him as weak, sentimental, and unfit to manage the estate. But as Jonathan's heir, Richard's presence was a constant thorn. Another reason Catherine knew she had to secure the future herself. Lawyer Ambrose Talbot laid out her grim options: sell the estate and workers, or somehow restore profitability. But with cotton prices falling and no money for new labor, the future looked impossible. Catherine spent sleepless nights over ledgers, candlelight flickering on her stern face. She scrawled numbers, considered debts, and weighed her pride against ruin. Somewhere in those long hours, a plan took root. Others in Burke County saw only a grieving widow. But behind closed doors, Catherine's grief hardened into resolve. She would not return to Augusta in shame. She would not watch her estate dissolve piece by piece into the hands of creditors. If the fields could not sustain her, if she could not buy more enslaved labor, then she would make her own. What she imagined was not the haphazard encouragement of births practiced quietly on many plantations. Catherine envisioned something colder, more deliberate. A system of breeding designed not only to replenish her labor force but to tie it by blood directly to her. She would create a workforce that could never be sold away, never escape her grip, because their very lineage would bind them to Thornhill. It was a thought that might have flickered briefly in another mind before being extinguished by decency or fear. But Catherine was not another mind. She was ambitious, practical, and desperate. And desperation often turns imagination into resolve. In her journals, written in cipher and disguised as agricultural notes, she began outlining the scheme. She called children seedlings, men rootstock, pregnancies plantings. Her words stripped humanity from flesh and blood, reducing people into units of production. What Catherine wrote that winter would become the blueprint of one of the most chilling experiments in the history of American slavery. And it all began with a widow staring into the firelight of her failing plantation, convinced she had discovered a way to outwit ruin by using the bodies of those she already owned. The plan revealed itself slowly, piece by piece, in Catherine Thornhill's restless nights. She studied the ledgers, replayed her lawyer's blunt advice, and looked out over fields that no longer yielded profit. Every path led to humiliation except one. If she could not buy more workers, she would breed them. Not in the careless way her neighbors occasionally spoke of, but with precision, calculation, and absolute control. Catherine did not think of it as madness. She thought of it as survival. In the spring of 1847, she began keeping a new kind of record. It was not a diary of feelings. Catherine was not sentimental. Instead, it was a ciphered log she called her cultivation records. Using substitutions, she masked her meaning. Seedlings for children, rootstock for chosen men, plantings for pregnancies. To anyone else, it might have looked like the scribbles of an ambitious gardener. But Catherine knew she was not tending crops. She was designing bloodlines. Her first choice of rootstock was Isaac, a 24-year-old enslaved man, tall, strong, steady. Born on Thornhill, Isaac had no illusions about his place. But he could not imagine the role Catherine had chosen for him. In March, she summoned him to the main house after nightfall. The overseer was gone, the quarters quiet. What occurred between them went unrecorded except for one cold line in Catherine's cipher. First planting complete. Weather clear and mild. By April, she believed herself pregnant. Her entry read, initial cultivation successful. Anticipated harvest. December. To her, it was not intimacy, not scandal. It was experiment, the first step toward a system she envisioned spanning generations. Richard, her stepson, began to notice her change. She declined rides, took meals in her chamber, and dismissed servants who might observe too closely. His unease grew sharper when he overheard a conversation with the local midwife, Miriam Grayson. The woman asked if Catherine was certain of her condition. Catherine lied smoothly, claiming her late husband had been intimate before his death. Richard knew the truth. Jonathan Thornhill had been bedridden for weeks before the fever claimed him. Suspicion gnawed at the boy until curiosity drove him to search her study. Hidden inside a locked drawer, he found the leather-bound journal. Hours of puzzle-solving led him to crack the cipher. What he read chilled him. Diagrams like livestock charts, lists of men, notes on physical traits, strength, endurance, temperament. Catherine wrote not like a grieving widow but like a breeder cataloging horses. Richard's discovery might have been her undoing, but Catherine was cunning. She confronted him with veiled threats. Family loyalty above all. Scandal would ruin them. No one would believe a resentful stepson. Richard, frail and isolated, was no match for her resolve. Soon after, he fell ill with symptoms suspiciously like poisoning. By December 1847, Richard was dead, consumption, the doctor said. Catherine wept at his funeral, then delivered a healthy baby boy days later, claiming he was Jonathan's premature child. No one dared question. This child, Jonathan Jr., was only the first. Over the next years, Catherine summoned other men. Thomas, Samuel, and others chosen for their bodies, never their will. Each encounter was reduced to a coded entry. Each birth was tallied as progress. She bore son after son, daughter after daughter, all raised within the house, better fed and clothed than the others, but still registered as enslaved in county records. The enslaved community began to whisper. They noticed who Catherine called to the house after dark, who was sold away once no longer useful, which children carried her eyes and her copper hair. They noticed her midwife's new cottage, the payments for silence. They noticed pregnancies cut short by bitter herbal concoctions when Catherine disapproved of the father. A system was emerging, cruel and deliberate. By the mid-1850s, Catherine had built what she believed was security. Children bound by blood, raised with obedience, groomed for future pairings. To visitors, Thornhill seemed to be recovering. Cotton yields improving, debts shrinking. But beneath the surface was a breeding ground not of crops, but of human lives carefully arranged like rows in a ledger. Catherine convinced herself she was innovating. In reality, she had only taken slavery's logic to its darkest conclusion. To treat human beings as property was evil enough, but to turn them into her own bloodline slaves was something far more monstrous. And it was only the beginning. By the summer of 1847, Richard Thornhill could no longer ignore the unease gnawing at him. His stepmother's routines had shifted too drastically. Her sudden withdrawal from society, her long evenings alone in the study, and her habit of dismissing servants when she once demanded constant attendance. Something was wrong. The truth revealed itself in fragments. A conversation overheard through the thin walls of Thornhill's parlor sealed his dread. Catherine had called for Miriam Grayson, the midwife who attended births across Burke County. Richard listened from behind the library bookcase as the older woman asked careful questions. "You're certain of your condition?" Catherine's answer was calm, confident. "Quite certain. Expect delivery in December." She spoke of intimacy with Jonathan before his death, but Richard's stomach clenched. He had sat at his father's bedside through January. The man had been half-conscious, feverish, incapable of such closeness. Catherine was lying. Richard's mind raced. Who was the father? Why the secrecy? The answer came weeks later when he noticed Isaac, the enslaved man Catherine had singled out, summoned repeatedly to the main house. Always after dark. Always when the overseer was away. Catherine's tone with him was unlike her clipped commands to others. measured, almost respectful. Richard pieced it together. Isaac was no servant that summer. He was her chosen partner. The horror deepened when Richard discovered the journal hidden in Catherine's desk. It was locked, but Richard had always had a talent for puzzles. Hours by candlelight revealed the cipher. Seedlings, rootstock, plantings. Line after line confirmed his suspicions. Catherine was not simply covering up a scandal. She was designing a program, breeding enslaved men with herself to create a future labor force bound by blood. Richard copied a few pages, his hands trembling. He considered his options: confront Catherine, tell the lawyer, write his grandfather in Augusta. But Catherine anticipated him. One evening at dinner, she looked across the table with those cold green eyes and asked, "Richard, have you been in my study?" Some of my papers seemed disturbed. His denial came too quickly, too thin. Catherine's voice hardened. Family loyalty is everything. Break that and we are animals tearing at each other. Do you understand? Her warning was a knife wrapped in silk. Richard nodded, but inside he seethed. Within weeks, his health began to falter. Fatigue, stomach pains, headaches that blurred his vision. Catherine brought him meals herself, insisting he take the tonic prescribed by Miriam Grayson. Richard recognized the signs: arsenic poisoning, the same symptoms he had read about in medical texts. He was being silenced slowly, his voice smothered before it could rise. By autumn, Richard was confined to bed. Too weak to fight, he penned a desperate letter to his grandfather, detailing Catherine's crimes. He entrusted it to a young house servant, Pearl, begging her to deliver it in secret. But fear of Catherine outweighed pity. Pearl carried the letter straight to her mistress. That evening, Catherine burned it in the fireplace before Richard's fevered eyes. "You're imagining things," she whispered almost tenderly. "The illness clouds your mind. It's a mercy you won't suffer long." Richard died on December 3, 1847, 3 weeks shy of his 17th birthday. Consumption, the doctor recorded. Catherine wept dutifully at the funeral, black veil hiding a face without tears. For days later, she gave birth to a healthy boy. She named him Jonathan after her late husband, explaining away the timing with a simple lie: the child was premature. Few in Burke County dared count backwards or question the grieving widow. The plantation moved on. Catherine had eliminated her only true obstacle. The overseer saw only improved yields. Neighbors whispered admiration for her efficiency. Lawyer Talbert handled her accounts without probing too deeply. None suspected the reality that within Thornhill's walls, Catherine was transforming desperation into a system of generational bondage more monstrous than the law itself. For the enslaved, suspicion turned into dread. They noticed the pattern. Men summoned to the house, children born with green eyes, midwife Grayson's frequent visits. Whispers spread through the quarters, though few dared speak above a murmur. Those who did remember Richard's sympathy felt the loss keenly. With him gone, there was no voice within the house to resist Catherine's control. By the dawn of 1848, Thornhill Estate stood at a crossroads. To outsiders, it was recovering from tragedy. To those within, it was becoming a laboratory of cruelty, ruled by a mistress who had convinced herself she could shape the future through blood. And her experiment had only just begun. From 1848 onward, Thornhill Estate became something unnatural, something different from any other plantation in Burke County. Outwardly, it appeared to be recovering. Cotton yields stabilized, debts shrank, and Catherine gained a reputation as a shrewd, if distant, widow who managed her affairs with uncommon efficiency. But those who lived inside Thornhill understood the truth. It was no longer a plantation in the ordinary sense. It was a breeding ground. Catherine bore children with calculated regularity. Between 1848 and 1853, she delivered 4 more beyond the first boy she had named Jonathan Jr., 3 daughters, Eleanor, Abigail, and Margaret, and another son, Samuel. Each father had been chosen with precision. Some were kept for multiple plantings. Others sold off once Catherine deemed their purpose complete. Isaac, the first man, was shipped to Alabama in 1849. His sale money used to pay down debts. To Catherine, he had served his purpose. She maintained her cultivation records with chilling detachment. Each pregnancy logged like a crop cycle. Each birth measured for health, coloring, strength. She noted which child showed sturdiness, which seemed intelligent, which had compliant temperaments. In her cipher, she designed future pairings decades in advance, weaving family trees that were less kinship than livestock charts. The children she birthed occupied a strange space. Legally, she registered them as enslaved, ensuring her claim in county records. Yet inside Thornhill's house they were given better food, cleaner clothes, and forbidden books. Catherine taught them to read, an act illegal under Georgia law, believing literacy would make them more loyal, more capable when it came time to manage her estate. To outsiders, they were orphans she had magnanimously taken in. To Catherine, they were the roots of her legacy, branches of a dynasty she alone controlled. But the others, the men, women, and children in the quarters, watched with growing unease. They knew the children were Catherine's blood. They saw the resemblance in the sharp cheekbones, the pale eyes, the copper-threaded hair. They saw which men were summoned and which women's pregnancies mysteriously ended in sudden bleeding after visits to Miriam Grayson, the midwife. Mrs. Grayson had become Catherine's accomplice. Her role extended beyond assisting with births. When enslaved women conceived outside of Catherine's chosen pairings, she was called to correct the mistake. Using bitter herbal mixtures, she induced miscarriages in shadowed rooms behind the overseer's cottage. The women rarely spoke of it. Trauma pressed their voices down, yet whispers circulated, stories of pregnancies that vanished overnight, of women weeping silently while blood stained their skirts. One such woman was Ruth. In the spring of 1851, she was 5 months pregnant when Catherine discovered her child was fathered not by the man chosen for her but by Samuel, a young field hand she loved. Catherine ordered the pregnancy terminated. Ruth fled in desperation, vanishing into the pine forests. She made it nearly 4 miles before hounds tracked her down. Dragged back by the overseer's men, she was held down while Miriam forced her to drink the abortive concoction. Ruth survived, but her spirit did not. She worked silently until fever took her 2 years later at the age of 24. Another tragedy unfolded in 1856. A girl named Sarah, only 14, was ordered paired with an older field hand, Elijah, nearly 3 times her age. Sarah's mother, Violet, begged Catherine to wait, pleaded that her daughter was still a child. Catherine's answer was cold. "You have 2 younger daughters. Do you wish me to sell them instead? Or will Sarah do her duty?" Sarah gave birth within a year and died from the complications of her body's youth. Violet sank into despair, eventually walking into the Savannah River and drowning herself. Stories like Ruth's and Sarah's multiplied, though they rarely reached beyond Thornhill. To neighbors, Catherine remained efficient, respectable, even enviable in her recovery. To those within her reach, she was something else entirely, a woman who believed she could play God with human lives. By 1856, Thornhill's enslaved population had grown again, not by purchase but by Catherine's breeding program. She now had 10 of her own children, ranging from infants to 8-year-olds, alongside the remaining enslaved families. The plantation seemed orderly, but beneath that order was a hierarchy twisted by Catherine's vision. There were the field workers, men and women who labored under the overseer's lash, fearing both sale and forced pairing. There were the house servants, 3 women and an older man, who maintained the domestic spaces. And there were the special children, Catherine's offspring, dressed better, fed better, taught to read, told they were chosen. They lived between 2 worlds, not quite enslaved, not quite free, objects of resentment and pity among the quarters, but still bound by Catherine's hand. The cruelty of this system lay not only in the physical violations but in the psychological torment. Men were forced into fatherhood they could never acknowledge. Women were stripped of choice, their bodies dictated by Catherine's cold charts. And the children grew up believing themselves privileged until the truth, always the truth, would one day seep through. Still, Catherine believed she was building something extraordinary. To her, Thornhill was becoming self-sufficient, its labor force multiplying without cost. She saw herself as a visionary, decades ahead of her neighbors. She rarely entertained visitors, and when she did, she projected the image of a virtuous Christian widow, careful to conceal the machinery of cruelty that turned behind her whitewashed walls. The world beyond Thornhill did not see the breeding years, but the enslaved did. They carried the knowledge in silence, in glances, in whispered warnings to their children. Beware the mistress. They understood what Catherine was doing, even if they lacked the words eugenics or program. They knew she was breeding people like livestock, and they waited with the patience of the oppressed, for the day when something, anything, would break. And in the distance, beyond Burke County, change was stirring. The nation itself was fracturing. Talk of secession echoed in courthouses. Violence in Kansas flared in newspapers. War was coming. Catherine might not have cared for politics, but her experiment would soon collide with forces greater than even her will. By the late 1850s, Catherine Thornhill's plan had become more than a means of survival. It had grown into obsession. Thornhill's ledgers showed reduced debts, cotton shipments increased modestly, and whispers of bankruptcy faded. But Catherine herself cared less about cotton now. Her real crop was the children, her children, and she wanted proof that her dynasty was taking root. It began innocently enough with journals, but soon she needed something tangible, something visible. She chose a small chamber off the east wing of the house, once used as a sewing room. The windows were shuttered, curtains drawn, and the door locked with a brass key she kept on her person. Servants called it the Forbidden Room. Catherine called it the Heritage Room. Inside, she created a shrine to her experiment. On one wall hung family trees she had drawn in careful script, each child connected by branching lines. But unlike the genealogies of proud Southern families, these charts were coded. Children were not marked by names, but by numbers, traits, and harvest years. Glass vials lined a shelf, each containing a lock of hair clipped from a newborn's head. A strand of pale copper here, a curl of dark wool there, each labeled with ciphered notes. Resilient, obedient, strong lungs. In another cabinet she kept baby teeth in small linen pouches, tied with thread. To Catherine, these were not macabre trophies. They were data points, evidence of progress. Visitors never saw this room. Not even the overseer was allowed near. Only Miriam Grayson, the midwife, occasionally entered, helping Catherine catalog her growing legacy. Together they whispered about which children seemed promising, which were weak, which might be paired in years to come. Among the enslaved, the room became legend. House servants cleaning nearby would hear Catherine murmuring late into the night, reciting names and numbers to herself as if in prayer. Once, a young servant girl stole a glance through the half-open door. She returned pale, whispering of jars, hair, bones. No one believed her at first, but when she refused to go near the East Wing again, others began to listen. For Catherine, the Heritage Room was not just record-keeping. It was devotion. She lit candles before her charts, sometimes kneeling, as if worshipping her own creation. She saw herself not as a widow battling ruin, but as a matriarch founding a dynasty greater than cotton, greater than Georgia, greater even than her name. And she was not content to stop. By 1859, she began planning a second generation, pairings not with herself but among her older children. Eleanor was 12, Jonathan Jr. nearly 13. Catherine sketched unions in her coded charts, noting which combinations might yield desirable stock. Her vision stretched decades into the future. Thornhill sustained by blood upon blood, a self-perpetuating system where no purchase was necessary. But such visions carried risk. Her children, once obedient, were growing older, curious, aware. Eleanor, in particular, had inherited Catherine's intelligence, but not her cruelty. She noticed the cipher, the locks of hair, the secretive tone in her mother's study. Though still a child, she sensed the weight of something unnatural pressing upon her family. Outside Thornhill, winds of change were blowing. Newspapers brimmed with news of John Brown's raid, Lincoln's speeches, Southern secessionists clamoring for war. Neighbors spoke anxiously of what would happen if abolitionists gained power. Yet within the walls of Thornhill, Catherine was unmoved. While Georgia fretted over politics, she whispered to her charts, clipping another lock of hair, adding another vial to her shelves. The heritage room grew crowded with proof of her obsession. It smelled of ink, wax, and old linen. To Catherine, it smelled of triumph. To anyone else, it would have reeked of madness. But madness thrives in silence, and for years no one dared disturb hers. By 1861, the world beyond Thornhill had grown restless. Abraham Lincoln's election sent shockwaves through Georgia, and within months, the state joined the Confederacy. Burke County men drilled on courthouse greens, muskets on shoulders, flags snapping in the wind. Neighbors spoke of honor, duty, and war's glory. But for Catherine Thornhill, politics mattered less than preservation. Her eyes were not on Richmond or Washington. They were fixed on her children, on the dynasty she had spent 14 years constructing. War meant disruption. Men vanished from the countryside, marched into battles far from Georgia's fields. Cotton prices soared, but labor thinned. Overseers were conscripted, leaving plantations weakened. Enslaved families whispered of escape to Union lines. Catherine saw the danger. If Thornhill fractured, her entire design could crumble. She reacted with ruthless efficiency. Her children, now numbering 12, were forbidden to leave the estate's grounds. She doubled patrols, chaining loyalty through fear. Rumors of rebellion among the enslaved reached her ears. Men muttering in the fields, women refusing to bear more children. Catherine's answer was swift. Suspected agitators were sold south, their families torn apart. Others were punished brutally, overseers' whip cracking louder than ever before. But fear was not her only tool. Catherine accelerated her breeding program, convinced war would destroy plantations that relied on purchase rather than self-sufficiency. She paired men and women against their will, ordering births like a general marshalling troops. In her ciphered records she wrote, "Conflict approaches. Secure legacy before disruption spreads." The enslaved felt the weight of her desperation. Miriam Grayson, the midwife, was summoned more often than ever, forced to oversee pregnancies, births, and corrections. By now she was old, her hands shaking, but Catherine demanded silence and obedience. To displease her was to risk ruin. Outside Thornhill, chaos pressed closer. By 1863, Union victories in Tennessee sent ripples southward. Burke County's men returned maimed or not at all. Food grew scarce. Refugees clogged the roads. Soldiers sometimes wandered the countryside in ragged groups, hungry and desperate. For Catherine, isolation became both shield and prison. Thornhill stood intact, but increasingly cut off. Her children were now entering adolescence. Eleanor was 15, Jonathan Jr. 16. They had grown up under Catherine's iron gaze, yet cracks were beginning to show. Eleanor read secretly from abolitionist tracts left behind by a traveling preacher, smuggled by a sympathetic servant. She began to question the ciphered charts, the heritage room, the whispers in the quarters. Jonathan Jr., proud but restless, asked why they could not attend school in Augusta, why their mother kept them hidden like secrets. Catherine silenced them with cold warnings. "You are Thornhills. You are not to question what keeps us alive." But her iron grip could not halt the tides. In 1864, Union General Sherman marched through Georgia, his army burning its way to the sea. The sound of cannon fire carried on the wind. Smoke blackened the skies of neighboring counties. Refugees stumbled past Thornhill, telling of plantations stripped bare, barns torched, families scattered. For the first time in years, Catherine's confidence faltered. She locked the heritage room, hid her journals beneath the floorboards, and gathered her children close. Yet she could not silence their questions, nor the growing defiance among the enslaved. Nights echoed with whispers, secret meetings, plans of flight should Union troops appear. Catherine responded with greater cruelty. Chains, confinements, punishments meted without pause. Her children watched, some with fear, others with disgust. The world was collapsing, and with it the illusion of her dynasty. Catherine clung to her vision, convinced that if Thornhill survived the war intact, her bloodline experiment would endure. But history was closing in, and no cipher could mask what was about to unravel. The collapse was not sudden. It came like a slow tightening noose, soldiers on the horizon, whispers of rebellion within, and the dawning realization that her children, her legacy, were beginning to resist her will. And resistance, once sparked, cannot be easily contained. By the summer of 1864, Thornhill's silence had become unbearable. Smoke from Sherman's march curled in the distance, the thunder of war edging closer with every week. But within the estate's shuttered halls, another kind of storm brewed. Catherine's children, no longer compliant, were beginning to ask questions their mother could not contain. Eleanor, sharp-eyed and restless at 15, was the first to probe deeply. One evening she wandered into the east wing, following the flicker of candlelight beneath the locked door of the heritage room. Catherine had left in haste, forgetting her brass key. Eleanor slipped inside. What she found shattered her childhood. The room smelled of wax and must, walls lined with charts inked in her mother's precise hand. Branching diagrams, coded notations, her name, not as Eleanor, but as Unit 7, harvest year 1849. Vials of hair glinted in the candlelight, each marked with dates and cryptic traits. Teeth in pouches, journals filled with strange words. Seedlings, rootstock, planting. Eleanor froze, heart pounding. For a moment she thought she was staring into a madwoman's laboratory, a place where life had been reduced to symbols and samples. She stole one of the journals and retreated to her room. Hours turned into days as she cracked the cipher, piecing together words and meanings. When at last she understood, tears blurred the ink. Her mother had not raised them as children. She had bred them as stock, part of a grotesque design. Eleanor realized her father was not Jonathan Thornhill at all. None of their fathers were husbands or masters. They were enslaved men, forced into Catherine's will. She told her brother Jonathan Jr. at once. At 16, proud and headstrong, he resisted at first. But when Eleanor showed him the charts, the vials of hair, the ciphered entries describing his birth, his defiance melted into horror. "We are her property," he whispered. "Her own blood, yet bound like the rest." The revelation spread among the siblings in fragments. Snatched conversations, stolen glances at the heritage room. Margaret wept openly. Samuel grew bitter and sullen. For the first time, the children saw their mother not as guardian but as captor. Whispers turned into defiance. Jonathan Jr. refused Catherine's commands, storming out of lessons she demanded. Eleanor confronted her mother directly. "Why are we numbers? Why are we written as if we were animals?" Catherine's face tightened with fury. "Because numbers do not lie, Eleanor. Blood is truth, and I am ensuring your survival when others will perish." But her words rang hollow. Catherine had underestimated what it meant to raise literate children. They understood too much now, thought too freely. And beyond Thornhill's gates, they sensed possibility. Union soldiers advancing, the very walls of slavery trembling. The enslaved community, too, noticed the change. Eleanor lingered near the quarters, listening to whispered prayers, watching as men sharpened tools in secret, as women murmured plans of flight. She no longer saw them as shadows. She saw them as kin, tied not only by labor but by the blood her mother had forced upon them. In the autumn, Catherine discovered one of her ciphered journals missing. Panic flashed across her face when she realized Eleanor had taken it. That night, she confronted her daughter in the parlor. "Do you think you understand?" she hissed. "You are nothing without me. Without my design, you would not even exist." Eleanor did not flinch. "Then better to exist free than to live as part of your experiment." It was the first open rebellion, spoken in words, not whispers. And it was only the beginning. For Catherine, the walls of Thornhill were closing in. Union soldiers to the north, rebellion brewing to the south, and now, defiance rising from within her own household. She tightened her grip, desperate to preserve her legacy. But even the strongest grasp cannot hold when blood itself begins to resist. By the winter of 1864, Thornhill Estate was a house of fractures. Union troops crept closer through Georgia's countryside. Enslaved families whispered openly of escape, and Catherine's children no longer hid their defiance. Catherine herself grew thinner, her face sharpened with sleeplessness, her voice edged with panic. She had spent nearly 2 decades building her dynasty, but now, for the first time, she felt it slipping. The breaking point came in late November. One of her younger sons, Samuel, refused a command to work alongside the overseer. Catherine struck him, and he shouted what no child of Thornhill had ever dared. "You are not my mother. You are my master." The words spread like fire through the house. Catherine's face went white, but her eyes burned with a fury that terrified even her loyal servants. That night, she retreated to the heritage room. Candles flickered as she pored over her charts, clutching her ciphered journal. To her mind, the rebellion was not in the fields but in her bloodline. Her children were no longer obedient seedlings. They were weeds threatening to strangle her carefully cultivated garden. And weeds, she reasoned, must be cut down. The next morning, she prepared a meal herself, unusual for a mistress of her stature. Bread, broth, and a sweet cordial. She served her children at the long oak table, urging them to eat. Eleanor noticed the bitterness in the drink first. She whispered urgently to Jonathan Jr., who pushed his cup aside. Suspicion spread. One by one, the children refused. Catherine's mask cracked. She slammed the table with her fist, shouting, "You are mine! You would be nothing without me!" The commotion drew others. Enslaved men and women crowded into the hall, watching as Catherine raged. For the first time, her authority faltered. Whispers turned to shouts, "Poison!" and panic swept the room. Jonathan Jr. overturned the table, dishes shattering, broth spilling across the floorboards. In the chaos, Catherine fled. Some said she ran into the woods, shawl trailing like smoke. Others swore she was dragged screaming toward the well behind the house, where her body was never recovered. A few claimed Union soldiers captured her days later on the road to Augusta, though no official record exists. What is certain is this: Catherine Thornhill vanished. Her heritage room was ransacked, journals scattered, vials smashed. The children survived, carried into freedom when Union troops finally swept through Burke County. Thornhill Estate fell into ruin, its bricks crumbling, its fields reclaimed by weeds. But Catherine's ghost lingered. For decades, neighbors whispered of her fate, some saying she still roamed the forests, searching for her legacy. Others insisting her spirit haunted the ruined well. Her children carried the scars of her obsession, scattered across the South in the aftermath of war, their lineage both secret and shame. History never recorded her trial, nor her burial. She slipped between the lines of the archive, her story reduced to rumor, her crimes hidden by silence. But in the whispers of Burke County, one truth endured. A mistress who tried to play God had finally been undone by her own blood. When Union soldiers finally reached Burke County in the spring of 1865, Thornhill Estate was a hollow shell of itself. The house stood, but its windows were shattered, doors hanging loose, fields overgrown with neglect. Inside, the heritage room was discovered in ruin. Journals torn apart, glass vials smashed, charts ripped from the walls. The soldiers lingered only long enough to shake their heads at the strange collection of remains before burning what was left. Among the freed, the Thornhill children were scattered. Some took new names, blending into communities of newly emancipated families. Jonathan Jr. vanished into the chaos of Reconstruction, perhaps determined never to be associated with the name Thornhill again. Eleanor moved north with relatives of freedmen, carrying scraps of her mother's journals as proof of the horrors she had endured. The younger siblings were taken in by churches, orphanages, or distant kin. Their stories fragment in records, sometimes a surname here, a census entry there, but never enough to fully trace the bloodline Catherine believed would outlast her. The enslaved who had suffered under Catherine's rule bore the heaviest scars. Some left the county immediately, heading north with Union regiments. Others remained in Georgia, trying to piece together families torn apart by her forced pairings and cruel separations. Oral histories passed quietly from parent to child, whispered warnings of the mistress who bred her own. Yet official records were silent. Local leaders had no desire to publicize a scandal that tainted their county's image. The war had left Georgia in ruins. Rebuilding required forgetting, not remembering. Catherine's story was erased from court ledgers, burial rolls, church minutes. For more than a century, her name faded into shadows. But shadows do not erase the truth. From time to time, stories resurfaced. An aging preacher recounting tales of a mistress with unnatural children. A farmer claiming to have found bones near the old Thornhill well. Families who whispered of green eyes passed down through generations. Each fragment hinted at what had happened, yet none were conclusive enough to be written into textbooks. What remains certain is this: Catherine Thornhill's attempt to create a dynasty ended in failure. Her children, instead of serving her legacy, rebelled against it. Her estate crumbled into ruin. Her name became a curse, and the program she nurtured with such cruelty vanished into history's silence. Still, the story lingers, unsettling in its unfinished edges. What happened to the children? Do descendants live today, carrying her blood without knowing its origin? And what does it mean for us to confront a past so grotesque that entire communities chose to bury it? The story of Catherine Thornhill is not just about one woman's cruelty. It is a mirror, showing us the darkest possibilities when power, desperation, and obsession go unchecked. It is a reminder that slavery was not only a system of forced labor but a system capable of breeding horrors that defy comprehension. Her name is missing from the records, her fate remains uncertain, but her shadow stretches long across the ruins of Burke County. And while others chose silence, we choose remembrance. Because to remember is to deny erasure. To remember is to honor those who lived, suffered, and resisted, even when their voices were nearly smothered. What do you think of Catherine Thornhill's story? Do you believe her bloodline still lingers, hidden in plain sight? Share your thoughts below and let's keep the conversation alive. And if stories like this grip you, disturb you, and remind you how much history still hides, then subscribe to Grave of the Shadows. Together, we will keep unearthing the truths that others tried to bury.